Oh, greetings, welcome to my humble abode. Please, take a seat. Mind the gravitational adjusters, they can be a bit temperamental with non-Zalaxy physiology. There we go. Perfect. You want to know about the humans? And specifically about the infamous Galactic Council incident? Well, you have come to the right Zalaxy. I was there, you know. Front row seat to the greatest political upset in the last 8 millennia of galactic governance. But first, some context. My name is Tazzik Vorn, Senior Diplomatic Observer for the Zalaxian Confederation. For over 30 standard cycles, I have documented the behaviors of emerging species as they join our grand galactic community. The humans, though, they were different. The first time I encountered a human was at the Preliminary Species Assessment Conference on Proxima Station. Ambassador Juno Parker, red hair that seemed to change color depending on the lighting. Fascinating biological quirk, that. Ambassador Vorn, she said, extending her hand in their customary greeting ritual. I have heard the Zalaxy are the most objective observers in the galaxy. I hope you will be fair in your assessment of Earth. I remember blinking all 3 of my eye membranes simultaneously. Objectivity is the cornerstone of diplomatic observation, Ambassador Parker. Hope is an emotional construct that has no bearing on the process. She laughed, actually produced audible vibrations of amusement at my statement of basic diplomatic principles. Well, I hope anyway, she said with a curious upward movement of her lips. That was my first clue that we were dealing with a profoundly unusual species. The Galactic Council consists of representatives from 173 species across 8 galactic arms. For 12,000 years, we have maintained a delicate balance of power through logical discourse, dispassionate negotiation, and rigorous adherence to the protocols of governance. Then the humans arrived. The Assessment Committee has concluded its evaluation of species 4573, designation humans from the planet Earth. It pronounced High Adjudicator Pelquin, his 7 tentacles perfectly still in the formal posture of official declaration. While demonstrating adequate technological advancement and rudimentary spatial navigation capabilities, the committee has serious reservations regarding their suitability for council membership. The chamber fell silent. 26 different atmospheric mixtures swirled through the grand hall as representatives leaned forward in anticipation. Species assessments rarely included serious reservations. The humans display an alarming propensity for emotional decision-making, continued Pelquin, his central eye stalk rigid with disapproval. Their diplomatic communications are rife with metaphorical language, humor, and emotional appeals rather than logical argumentation. Their governing structures frequently prioritize concepts such as hope, fairness, and compassion over efficiency and logical optimization. Ambassador Parker stood at the petitioner's podium, her face displaying what I now recognize as the human expression of trying not to roll her eyes. Fascinating micromuscular control, really. Furthermore, Pelquin's voice resonated through the chamber. They appear constitutionally incapable of separating emotional responses from rational discourse. The committee recommends a probationary observation period of no less than 50 standard cycles before reconsideration for council membership. 50 cycles. It was unprecedented. Most species received 5 or 10 cycles at most. The council chamber erupted in the equivalent of murmurs for various species, some releasing pheromones of surprise, with others vibrating their communication appendages in rapid patterns of disbelief. Ambassador Parker cleared her throat. Another uniquely human behavior. They produce excess mucus just to express social signals. Inefficient, but oddly effective. High Adjudicator Pelquin, honored representatives of the Galactic Council, she began. On behalf of Earth, I thank you for your thorough assessment of our species. Standard diplomatic response. But then she smiled. A full human smile showing teeth, a gesture that on at least 43 council worlds would be considered a direct threat of physical violence. However, I must respectfully disagree with your characterization of human emotional capacity as a disadvantage. The Vorkal representative's gas sacs expanded in shock. The Triskelion delegation's crystalline communication structures darkened perceptibly. Even I found myself extending my sensory filaments to their full alert position. Emotions are not separate from reasoning, Parker continued, her voice growing stronger. They are an essential component of advanced decision-making. Without emotional context, pure logic becomes detached from value and meaning. Our emotions don't impair our judgment, they inform it. Ambassador Parker interrupted Counselor Zren of the Muxilian Combine, his nutrient absorption membranes pulsating with what passed for amusement among his kind. Your very defense proves our point. You respond to a logical assessment with an emotional appeal. Is it emotional to state facts, Counselor? Parker replied, not missing a beat. Earth has achieved peace among our nations despite thousands of years of conflict. We have reversed catastrophic climate change on our world. We have extended our average lifespan by over 40% in just 2 centuries, all while maintaining artistic and cultural expression that gives our existence meaning beyond mere survival. Meaning beyond survival, repeated Counselor Thex of the Dormanian Federation, as if the translator had malfunctioned. What other meaning is there? And that, dear visitor, was when I began to understand just how different humans truly are. Over the next several rotations, I observed Ambassador Parker and her team closely. Their diplomatic compound on Nexus Prime became my primary research focus. While other observers dismissed the humans as an amusing curiosity, a species that would either adapt to galactic norms or remain perpetually on the periphery, I sensed something more significant was unfolding. The humans established relationships with a dizzying array of species. Not strategic alliances based on resource optimization or security calculations, actual personal relationships. They remembered the names of subordinate staff members. They inquired about familial units. They expressed interest in cultural practices. Ambassador Vorn called out diplomatic attaché Miguel Ortega one afternoon as I was conducting standard surveillance of their compound perimeter. Would you like to join us? We are having a barbecue. It's a traditional Earth social gathering centered around the ritualistic combustion of animal protein. I should have declined. Interspecies social engagements outside formal diplomatic functions were highly irregular. But scientific curiosity prevailed. For observational purposes, I will attend, I replied. The barbecue was chaos. Humans producing loud vocalizations of pleasure. Music with irregular rhythmic patterns designed to stimulate emotional responses. Consumption of fermented beverages that deliberately impaired cognitive function. And everywhere laughter. So much laughter. Try this, said Ortega, handing me a plate with what appeared to be carbonized muscle tissue. It's called brisket. Smoked for 12 hours. Intentionally delayed protein preparation seems inefficient, I noted. Ortega grinned. That's what makes it good, my friend. The waiting, the anticipation, the process. I am not your friend, I corrected automatically. I am a diplomatic observer assigned to document your species' behaviors. Sure, he replied, making that curious human gesture of liquid consumption known as taking a swig from his bottle. But you are here at our barbecue, eating our food. Where I come from, that makes us at least barbecue buddies. I consumed the brisket. It was not unpleasant. As the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate evening conditions, I found myself in conversation with Ambassador Parker. She had consumed several fermented beverages and was displaying the human phenomenon known as getting philosophical. You know what your council doesn't understand, Tazzik? May I call you Tazzik? My designation is acceptable in its complete form, I replied. The council thinks emotions are messy, she continued as if I hadn't spoken. They think they are inefficient. But emotions are evolutionary adaptations that helped us survive. Fear kept us alive when predators attacked. Love ensured we protected our children. Disgust prevented us from consuming toxins. Anger motivated us to fight injustice. Yet your own historical records indicate that emotions frequently lead to irrational behaviors, violence, and suboptimal decision-making, I countered. She laughed. Absolutely. We are a mess sometimes. But without emotions, What's the point of any of this? She gestured broadly at the sky above us, filled with the distant light of millions of stars. Why build civilizations? Why explore the universe? Why form connections with other beings? Logic alone doesn't answer the why, Tazzik. Only emotions do that. I recorded her statement for further analysis. It seemed contradictory, yet contained a certain internal consistency I couldn't immediately dismiss. 2 standard cycles passed. The humans continued their diplomatic efforts despite their probationary status. They hosted cultural exchanges, participated in scientific collaborations, and attended every open council session, always presenting meticulously researched proposals that were invariably dismissed for being too subjective or insufficiently optimized. Then came the Krelvax Crisis. The Krelvax, enormous gas-based entities from the outer spiral arm, had detected our civilization and were approaching council space. Initial communication attempts failed spectacularly. The Krelvax language, if it could be called that, consisted entirely of complex gravitational wave patterns that defied conventional translation. The Council's response was predictably logical. Defensive perimeters were established. Resource allocation algorithms were recalculated to account for potential conflict scenarios. Communication specialists redoubled their efforts to develop theoretical translation matrices. During an emergency session, Ambassador Parker requested permission to address the Council. Surprisingly, it was granted. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of desperation. Honored representatives, she began. Our analysis suggests the Krelvax are not hostile but curious. Their approach vector has adjusted multiple times to avoid inhabited systems, even at the cost of efficiency. This indicates awareness and consideration of other life forms. Your speculation is noted, Ambassador, responded High Adjudicator Pelquin. However, without verifiable communication, defensive preparations must continue according to Protocol 7 billion Delta. With respect, we believe we have found a way to communicate with them, Parker said. Then she did something unprecedented in Council history. She brought a musical instrument into the chamber. This is a cello, she explained as Attach Ortega carried the wooden object to the center of the floor. It produces sound through vibration, but more importantly, it creates precise gravitational waves as a byproduct of those vibrations. Councillor Thex's feeding appendages twitched in agitation. This is absurd. You propose to communicate with an unknown, potentially hostile species using an entertainment device? Parker's smile was patient. Music isn't just entertainment, Councillor. It's mathematical, physical, and emotional communication combined into one form. And if our calculations are correct, this particular instrument produces gravitational wave patterns structurally similar to Krelvax emissions, just at a much smaller scale. Before anyone could object further, a human named Sophia Lynn took a seat behind the cello and began drawing a fibrous rod across its tensioned filaments. The sounds that emerged filled the chamber deep, resonant vibrations that seemed to penetrate beyond auditory perception. For 23 minutes, Lynn played what I later learned was a composition called Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 in G major. The council representatives sat in stunned silence. Even I found the experience affecting. When she finished, Parker spoke again. We propose broadcasting this and similar compositions toward the approaching Krelvax, amplified to produce gravitational waves they can detect. Not as a message exactly, but as a gesture. A demonstration that we understand vibration, harmony, mathematics, and expression are interconnected. This is highly irregular, Pelquin began, but was interrupted by an alert from the central communication system. Incoming transmission, announced the automated voice, unknown format. Attempting translation. What followed was extraordinary. From the council's speakers came sounds reminiscent of the cello but overlaid with deep, resonant patterns that seemed to vibrate the very molecules of the chamber. It continued for exactly 23 minutes, the same duration as Lynn's performance. They are responding in kind, whispered Parker, her eyes displaying the excess moisture humans produce during strong emotional states. They are talking to us. Over the next 14 rotations, humans led the communication efforts with the Krelvax. They sent more music, not just cello compositions, but a range of what they called orchestral works. The Krelvax responded with increasingly complex gravitational wave patterns that gradually began to form recognizable mathematical sequences. "They are teaching us their language," explained Parker during a briefing session. "And we are teaching them ours. Not through logic or formal linguistic structures, but through shared experience of mathematical beauty." "Mathematical beauty," repeated Counselor Zren skeptically. "An oxymoronic concept." Parker just smiled. "To humans, mathematics has always been as much an art as a science. The elegance of a proof, the symmetry of an equation, these things speak to us on an emotional level." It appears the Krelvax experienced something similar. Remarkably, she was correct. Within 30 rotations, basic communication protocols were established with the Krelvax. They were indeed explorers, not conquerors. They were fascinated by solid matter life forms and wished to exchange knowledge. They had detected our civilization's energy emissions centuries ago and had journeyed across half the galaxy simply out of curiosity. When the first formal diplomatic exchange with the Krelvax was scheduled, they specifically requested that the emotional beings who speak through vibrations represent the Council. The humans, still on probationary status, were suddenly the most important diplomatic asset in the galaxy. The irony was not lost on Ambassador Parker. As she prepared to depart for the meeting in the neutral space established at the edge of Council territory, she found me observing the preparations. "Well, Tazzik," she said with that peculiar upward curve of her lips, "still think our emotions make us unsuitable for galactic politics." "The situation remains anomalous," I replied carefully. "One successful communication does not invalidate the broader concerns about emotional decision-making in complex political environments." She laughed. "You are learning, though. That was almost diplomatic." "I am always diplomatic. It is my function." "No," she said, her expression shifting to something more serious. "Being diplomatic isn't about following rules or protocols. It's about building connections between different minds, different perspectives. Sometimes that requires logic, yes, but sometimes it requires intuition, empathy, even music." As her transport departed for the rendezvous point, I found myself experiencing an unusual neural pattern. It took several micronits to identify it as anticipation. I was actually looking forward to seeing what would happen next. And that, my curious visitor, is when I began to suspect that humans might not just change how they operated within our political system. They might change the system itself. But the Krelvax situation was merely the prelude. The true test of human diplomatic capability and the event that would forever transform galactic politics was yet to come. It began with a mysterious transmission from deep space, continued with the unprecedented Alliance crisis, and culminated in what humans now call the emotional gambit. That, however, is where we must pause our tale for now. My vocal organs require hydration, and I sense from your posture that you too could benefit from a respite. The second part of this extraordinary saga, how humanity's emotional nature ultimately saved the Council from its own logical paralysis, will have to wait for our next meeting. Until then, ponder this: in a universe governed by the same physical laws everywhere, why did emotions evolve at all? What advantage could they possibly provide that pure logic cannot? The humans believe they know the answer. And after witnessing what happened next, I'm inclined to think they might be right. "Ah, you have returned. Excellent. The beverage I have prepared is a human concoction called coffee. They claim it stimulates neural function, though I find its primary effect is making one need to utilize waste elimination facilities with alarming frequency. Nevertheless, it has grown on me, much like the humans themselves." Where were we? Ah, yes. The Krelvax situation had been resolved through what the Council reluctantly acknowledged as unconventional but effective diplomatic measures. The humans had earned a modicum of respect, though most species still regarded them as curiosities rather than equals. Ambassador Parker and her team returned from the Krelvax negotiations to a decidedly mixed reception. The official council recognition was clinically appreciative. The council acknowledges the utility of species 4573 in establishing preliminary communication protocols with the non-corporeal entities designated Krelvax. Utility, Parker repeated when she read the statement. Like we are some kind of translation device, is that not accurate? I inquired. Your species' unusual predisposition toward musical expression proved unexpectedly applicable to the situation. She gave me that look humans have, the one where they briefly close their eyes while exhaling forcefully through their nasal passages. Tazzik, we didn't succeed because we had some special talent for music. We succeeded because we were willing to try something illogical, something emotional and intuitive. We connected with the Krelvax because we didn't just analyze them as a problem to be solved. I recorded her statement without comment. In retrospect, I should have paid more attention. The transmission arrived 42 rotations later. A deep space communication probe detected at first a signal unlike any previously catalogued in Council records. It originated from the Nexus void, a vast region of space avoided by all Council species due to its unusual gravimetric distortions and unpredictable radiation bursts. The Computational Analysis Division spent 12 rotations attempting to decipher the transmission. Their conclusion was troubling. It contained fragments of communication protocols from 17 different Council species, spliced together in a manner suggesting deliberate collection and study rather than random acquisition. Someone or something had been watching us for a very long time. The Council convened an emergency session. High Adjudicator Pelquin's central eye stalk twitched continuously as he addressed the chamber. The evidence suggests an advanced technological civilization capable of long-range surveillance has been observing Council space. The fragmented nature of the transmission and its origin point make traditional communication approaches problematic. The Council must determine an appropriate response. Strategy. The debate that followed was predictably methodical. The Defense Coalition advocated for immediate military preparation. The isolationist bloc proposed enhanced shielding of all communication networks. The Progressive Alliance suggested sending scientific expeditions to the edge of the void. Each proposal was dissected, analyzed, and ultimately deemed insufficient based on the limited available data. The logical impasse was frustrating even to my neutral sensibilities. Then Ambassador Parker requested speaking privileges. This time there was notably less resistance to her participation. Honored representatives, she began, we have analyzed the transmission from a different perspective. Instead of focusing solely on the technical aspects of the signal, we looked at its composition, why these particular fragments of communication were included, and how they were arranged. Councillor Thex's feeding appendages clicked impatiently. And what profound insight has your emotional analysis yielded, Ambassador? Parker's lips curved upward slightly. We believe it's an invitation. The chamber erupted in the multidimensional equivalent of skeptical murmuring. An invitation, repeated Councillor Zren. To what, precisely? To prove ourselves worthy of contact, Parker replied. The fragments aren't random. They all contain elements of diplomatic first contact protocols from various species. But they are arranged in a pattern that creates gaps, missing pieces that, if filled correctly, would complete a coherent communication matrix. It's a test, added Atash Ortega, who stood beside her. Or maybe a puzzle. Either way, it's not a threat. High Adjudicator Pelquin's voice cut through the chamber. This interpretation is speculative at best. There is insufficient evidence to support such a conclusion. With respect, High Adjudicator, Parker countered, there's insufficient evidence to support any conclusion. But consider this. A civilization advanced enough to monitor our communications for centuries could certainly attack if that was their intention. Instead, they sent a message constructed from our own communication protocols. That suggests interest in dialogue, not conquest. What followed was one of the most heated debates I had witnessed in my 30 cycles of Council observation. The methodical rhythm of logical discourse gave way to something more urgent, more dynamic. It wasn't quite human-style emotional argumentation, but it wasn't purely rational either. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Council would prepare defensive measures while simultaneously working to complete the communication matrix the humans had identified. If it truly was an invitation, they would accept it cautiously. For the next 28 rotations, interspecies teams worked to analyze the transmission and develop potential responses. The humans were integrated into these teams not as leaders but as consultants, their perspective deemed potentially valuable if properly constrained by logical oversight. I was assigned to observe the primary response team, which included specialists from 11 species, including diplomatic communications expert Lana Wolf representing Earth. The fundamental problem, explained theoretical communications coordinator Dr. ZXX of the Frixian Collective, is determining which communication elements belong in the gaps of the matrix. There are 7,823 possible combinations that would create syntactically viable sequences, but only one that would make sense, Wolf countered, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. Look at the emotional cadence of the fragments. There's a rhythm to them, a rising and falling pattern. Emotional cadence is not a quantifiable metric, Dr. ZXX responded, his sensory filaments contracting in what I recognized as the Frixian expression of dismissal. Not in your analytical models? No, Wolf conceded. But communication isn't just about information transfer. It's about connection. The entities who sent this message chose these specific fragments for a reason. They are not just testing our technological capability, they are gauging our understanding of communication itself. And for 16 consecutive work periods, the team oscillated between computational approaches and what Wolf called intuitive analysis. Progress was minimal. The Frixian models identified hundreds of viable solutions, none clearly superior to the others. Wolf's approach generated interesting hypotheses, but lacked the rigorous verification protocols required by Council standards. Then Wolf did something unexpected. During a scheduled rest period, she approached me in the facility's nutrition center. "Observer Vorn," she said, sliding her tray onto the surface next to mine. "May I speak with you unofficially? All interactions with Council diplomatic personnel are officially recorded," I informed her. She smiled. "Of course they are, but you have been watching us humans, I mean longer than most. You were present during the Krelvax situation. You have observed Ambassador Parker extensively." "That is correct. So you have had more exposure to human decision-making processes than almost any other Council representative." I considered this. I have documented approximately 7,342 standard hours of human diplomatic activity. Then I'd like your perspective on something. She leaned forward. "Do you think we are approaching this transmission problem correctly?" The question was unusual. Observer opinions are rarely solicited. "It is not my function to evaluate methodology, only to document it," I replied. Wolf's facial expression displayed what I had come to recognize as disappointment combined with mild frustration. "Okay, let me ask differently. Based on your observations, what patterns have you noticed in successful human problem-solving approaches compared to standard Council methodologies?" This was a factual question about documented patterns, acceptable to answer. Human approaches typically incorporate 3 elements absent from standard Council protocols, I said. First, they utilize intuitive leaps that bypass sequential logical steps. Second, they frequently employ metaphorical thinking to recontextualize problems. Third, they integrate emotional responses into their decision matrices rather than filtering them out. Wolf nodded eagerly. "And in situations where human approaches have yielded successful outcomes, which of these elements appeared most significant?" I processed my observational data. The integration of emotional context into problem assessment showed the strongest correlation with positive outcomes, particularly in first contact scenarios and negotiations involving significant cultural differences. Her eyes widened slightly. "You have actually quantified that?" "It is my function to identify patterns in diplomatic interactions," I stated. "The correlation is statistically significant at p0.03. What happened next was unexpected. Wolf placed her hand briefly on my upper appendage, a human gesture of gratitude or connection that violated at least 2 council protocols for interspecies interaction. "Thank you, Observer Vorn," she said. "You have just given me an idea." The following work period, Wolf presented a radical proposal to the response team. Instead of trying to complete the communication matrix with technically optimal solutions, she suggested focusing on the emotional context of the fragments. Each piece contains not just communication protocols but cultural signifiers, she explained. References to historical events, philosophical concepts, artistic expressions unique to each species. What if those are the actual message? What if the gaps are meant to be filled with our own cultural signifiers, showing that we understand the importance of cultural context in communication? Dr. ZXX's sensory filaments flattened against his cranial casing. That approach lacks methodological rigor. It would be impossible to verify the correctness of such a response before transmission. "Exactly," Wolf replied with a curious expression of satisfaction. "That's the point. There's no objectively correct answer. It's about demonstrating our understanding that communication is inherently subjective and culturally bound. We need to respond not just with technical accuracy but with cultural authenticity." The debate lasted for 3 full work periods. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The team would develop 2 parallel responses, one using traditional computational optimization and one using Wolf's cultural context approach. For the next 7 rotations, the team worked on both solutions. The computational approach produced a technically flawless response that completed the communication matrix with optimal efficiency. Wolf's approach produced something quite different, a response that incorporated cultural elements from 23 council species, including human music, Zelaxi observational poetry, Phyrexian mathematical harmonics, and Dormanian silence patterns. When both were complete, they were presented to the council for final approval. The debate was predictably polarized. The optimized response demonstrates our technological capability and logical approach to communication, argued Councillor Thex. It is clearly superior. But it lacks soul, countered Ambassador Parker. It's technically perfect but culturally empty. If these entities have been studying us for centuries, they already know we can solve technical puzzles. Perhaps they are looking for something more. Soul is not a quantifiable metric in communication efficacy, Pelquin stated. Parker smiled. Neither is beauty, high adjudicator, yet most council species have some concept of aesthetic preference. Neither is meaning, yet we all seek it. Some of the most important aspects of existence resist quantification. The council voted. By a margin of 97 to 76, they selected the computational solution. The human approach was dismissed as excessively subjective and unnecessarily complex. The optimized response was transmitted toward the Nexus void. For 12 rotations, the council waited. No reply came. Then something unprecedented occurred. Ambassador Parker requested an emergency session of the council not to discuss the failed communication attempt, but to address what she called a matter of existential significance to all council species. Her request should have been denied. Stationary species had no authority to convene emergency sessions. Yet something had changed in the council's perception of humans. The request was granted. The chamber was filled to capacity when Parker took the speaker's position. Her team stood behind her, their expressions unusually solemn. "Honored representatives of the Galactic Council," she began, "I come before you today not as a petitioner seeking membership, but as a bearer of critical information. While the Council has been focused on the transmission from the Nexus void, we have discovered something far more concerning." She activated the central display system. A series of communication logs appeared: internal Council messages, diplomatic exchanges, defense coordination protocols. For the past 38 rotations, we have detected systematic access of Council-secure communications by an unknown entity, Parker continued. The intrusion pattern is sophisticated enough to evade standard security protocols but leaves trace signatures in quantum entanglement patterns that our systems are designed to detect. High Adjudicator Pelquin's eye stalk rigid with alarm. This is a serious accusation, Ambassador. Our security systems are the most advanced in known space. Yes, they are, Parker agreed, which is why this infiltration is so concerning. We believe it originated from within the Council itself. The chamber erupted in the multidimensional equivalent of outrage. Accusations of espionage between Council species were virtually unknown in 12,000 years of galactic governance. What evidence supports this extraordinary claim? Demanded Councillor Zren. Parker nodded to Attache Ortega, who activated a secondary display. We have identified the quantum signature of the intrusion. It bears markers consistent with Dormanian encryption technology but carries transmission patterns typical of Phyrexian communication systems. Either one species is attempting to implicate another, or more likely someone is using stolen technology from multiple sources. The implications were staggering. For the first time in my observational career, I witnessed the Council in a state approaching panic. Species with historical tensions began activating protective fields around their delegation areas. Communication appendages vibrated with accusatory patterns. The defense liaisons contacted their respective fleets. Parker's voice cut through the chaos. We do not believe any Council species is responsible. The pattern is too perfect, too precisely calculated to create maximum distrust. This is deliberate destabilization by an external force. The void entity, whispered Councillor Thex, his feeding appendages completely still in the Dormanian expression of profound shock. That's our assessment, Parker confirmed. We believe the transmission was never a test or invitation. It was a distraction keeping us focused on solving a puzzle while they infiltrated our systems and gathered strategic information. If this is true, Pelquin's voice resonated through the chamber, we face an unprecedented security breach. All systems must be isolated, all fleet movements suspended, until we can verify the extent of the infiltration. With respect, High Adjudicator, Parker interrupted. Isolation is exactly what they want. Division. Suspicion. Paralysis. What alternative do you propose, Ambassador? Pelquin asked, his tone reflecting unusual deference to a probationary species representative. Parker took a deep breath, another curious human physiological response to stress. Unified action. Transparency between all Council species, and immediate dispatch of a direct contact mission to the origin point of the transmission. A contact mission? Councillor Zren's gas sacs expanded in alarm. That would be recklessly endangering Council representatives. Not if we send the right representatives, Parker countered. Not if we send a delegation that understands what we are truly facing. And that, my curious visitor, is how I found myself aboard the diplomatic vessel Harmonious Dialogue, traveling toward the Nexus void with Ambassador Parker, Attache Ortega, Dr. ZXX, and representatives from 4 other Council species. The journey took 27 rotations. During that time, something remarkable happened. The rigid protocols governing interspecies interaction gradually dissolved as we faced the unknown together. Dr. ZXX began asking questions about human intuitive leaps. Grel Taz of the Dormanian Federation engaged in what humans call philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness. Even I found myself participating in their strange ritual of sharing meals. Despite having no biological need for simultaneous nutrition, as we approached the void's perimeter, Parker called us together in the ship's central chamber. We don't know what we will find, she said, her voice carrying what humans call gravity but has nothing to do with gravitational forces. But I believe our strength lies not in our technological capabilities or defensive systems, but in our diversity of perspective. For 12,000 years, the Council has valued logical consensus above all else. But true resilience comes from cognitive diversity, from having multiple ways of understanding and responding to the universe. A provocative theory, Ambassador, remarked Dr. ZXX, his sensory filaments extending in what I now recognized as an expression of intellectual interest rather than dismissal, though difficult to test under controlled conditions. Parker smiled. "We are about to test it in the most uncontrolled conditions imaginable, Doctor." The entity awaiting us at the coordinates specified in the transmission defied all Council classification systems. It existed as a fluctuating pattern of energy and matter, simultaneously solid and gaseous, organic and technological. Our sensors registered it as both alive and not alive, singular and plural. Standard communication protocols failed completely. The entity absorbed our transmission beams without response. Computational models could not predict its behavior patterns. For 3 full rotations, we attempted every established contact methodology in the Council database. Nothing worked. Then, on the 4th rotation, Ambassador Parker did something that violated 17 different Council protocols. She took a small craft and piloted it directly toward the entity, alone. "Ambassador, this action is categorically prohibited," I transmitted to her vessel. "The potential risks cannot be quantified." "Exactly, Tazzik," she replied, and I detected that curious vocal pattern humans produce when amused during serious situations. Some things can't be quantified. That's what the Council has never understood about humans. We don't just accept uncertainty, we embrace it. Her craft disappeared into the swirling pattern of the entity. For 3.7 hours, we detected no transmissions, no signs of the vessel, nothing to indicate Parker's status. Then both emerged. The small craft intact, and the entity, now configured into a roughly spherical pattern of organized energy. "Transmission incoming," announced the ship's system, format unknown. Attempting translation. What followed was unlike any communication I had ever witnessed. Not words, not data, but a stream of sensory impressions, colors that seemed to carry emotional weight, sounds that conveyed conceptual frameworks, patterns that somehow translated directly into understanding. The entity was ancient. It had observed thousands of civilizations across multiple galaxies over millions of years. It tested each one not for technological prowess but for a specific quality it considered essential for advanced intelligence, but a capacity to integrate multiple modes of cognition. Purely logical civilizations inevitably stagnated or self-destructed, unable to adapt to paradigm-shifting challenges. Purely emotional ones rarely achieved interstellar capability. Only those that balanced and integrated diverse cognitive approaches achieved true longevity. The Council, it had determined, was dangerously imbalanced toward logical processing. The human species represented a potential corrective force if they could influence Council development without being assimilated into its rigid cognitive framework. The infiltration of Council systems had been real but benign, a demonstration of the vulnerability created by overly systematized thinking. The entity had no hostile intent. It merely sought to prevent our civilization from following the same path as countless others before us. "It was testing us," Ortega said when the transmission ended. "Not our technology, not our defenses, but our capacity to transcend our own cognitive limitations." And Parker passed the test by doing something completely illogical, added Dr. ZXX, his sensory filaments vibrating in what appeared to be the Frixian equivalent of wonder. Not illogical, I found myself saying, or illogical. Operating outside established logical frameworks rather than counter to them. When we returned to Council Space 41 rotations later, we found a governance body in crisis. The temporary communication isolation protocols had evolved into a full diplomatic standoff between major Council factions. Military vessels had been mobilized. Economic sanctions had been implemented. 12,000 years of stability teetered on the edge of collapse. The Council chamber was in continuous emergency session when we arrived. The moment we entered, the cacophony of accusations and counter-accusations ceased. All sensory organs turned toward our delegation and particularly toward Ambassador Parker. "Ambassador," High Adjudicator Pelquin's voice carried uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Your team's disappearance was interpreted by some as confirmation of human involvement in the security breach. I assure you, High Adjudicator, we were exactly where we said we would be," Parker replied calmly. "And we have returned with information critical to the future of the Council." For the next 12 hours, our delegation presented everything we had learned from the entity which now referred to itself as the Nexus in our communications. The Council listened in stunned silence as Parker explained the true nature of the test, the purpose of the infiltration, and the warning about cognitive imbalance. For 12,000 years, this Council has prided itself on logical governance, she concluded, and that approach has created remarkable stability. But stability is not the same as resilience. True resilience requires cognitive diversity, the ability to approach challenges from multiple perspectives simultaneously. She gestured toward our delegation. Look at what we accomplished. A human, a Phyrexian, a Dormanian, a Zelaxi, a Vex, and a Triskelion, working together not despite our different cognitive approaches but because of them. We succeeded where a purely logical approach would have failed. Councillor Thex's feeding appendages trembled slightly. You propose a fundamental restructuring of council governance based on a single anomalous encounter? I propose an evolution, Parker corrected, not abandoning logic but supplementing it, not dismissing emotions as irrelevant, but recognizing their value in certain contexts, not insisting on a single correct methodology, but embracing cognitive diversity as a strength rather than a weakness. And if we refuse? Asked Councillor Zren. Parker shrugged a uniquely human gesture of acceptance combined with resignation. Then humanity will withdraw its petition for council membership and forge its own path among the stars. But we will do so with regret, knowing that an opportunity for mutual growth was missed. The debate lasted for 17 rotations. Arguments ranged from technical analyses of cognitive optimization to philosophical explorations of consciousness itself. Species that had never questioned the Council's logical foundation began considering alternatives. Those that had privately harbored doubts finally voiced them openly. In the end, the vote was surprisingly decisive. By a margin of 142 to 31, the Council approved what became known as the Cognitive Diversity Doctrine, a fundamental restructuring of governance to incorporate multiple decision-making methodologies, depending on the nature of the challenge. And humanity was granted full Council membership, effective immediately. As the chamber erupted in a multidimensional expression of approval ranging from pheromone releases to harmonic vibrations to human applause, Ambassador Parker found me observing it from my designated position. Well, Tazzik, she said with that curious upward curve of her lips, what does the official observer make of all this? I considered my response carefully. I observed that the Council has undergone the most significant structural change in its 12,000-year history, precipitated by a species that has existed for less than 1/10,000th of that time. She laughed. Is that approval I detect in your voice, Observer Vorn? Observers do not approve or disapprove. We simply observe. Of course, she replied. Then, lowering her voice, she added, but between us, I think you might be developing a dangerous human trait. And what trait would that be, Ambassador? Her eyes displayed that curious crinkle at the corners that indicates genuine human amusement. Hope, Tazzik. You are beginning to hope. As I watched her rejoin her celebrating team, I ran a diagnostic on my neural patterns. There was indeed an anomalous signature present, a persistent activation in circuits typically associated with anticipatory processing and positive outcome projection. If I were human, I might call it hope. As a Zelaxi observer, I merely noted it as an interesting data point worthy of further study. But I did not attempt to suppress it. And that, my curious visitor, is the true story of how humans with their messy emotions, their illogical intuitions, and their baffling capacity for both remarkable wisdom and astounding foolishness transformed galactic politics forever. They were indeed too emotional for the old system of governance. And that is precisely why they won. Now, would you care for more coffee? I find I have developed quite a taste for it. Much like I have developed a taste for human stories. They rarely proceed in a logical sequence, but somehow they always seem to arrive exactly where they need to be.